Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at the Outdoor Art Club for the presentation, The Insect Crisis and Why It Matters and What You Can Do About It. I am Lily Stamets, and I am working with fellow Zoom team member Sherry Jones to bring you this program. As you know, we are using the Zoom platform today. For you, those of you who are not familiar with the Outdoor Art Club, we are a nonprofit women's organization founded in 1902. The club engages in civic, cultural, and charitable work in our community. This includes presenting public programs like this one we're doing today for our annual speaker series. And before I turn over today's program to Dr. Silva, I want you to note that we have a Q&A function, which is most likely at the bottom of your screen. You are welcome to put questions in for our speaker at any time in the Q&A box. At this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Silva, who is our speaker today, and he is going to present for you the insect crisis, why it matters, and what we can do about it. Dr. Silva.
Thank you so much to Lily and to Sherry and to Bridget and all the organizers for inviting me, and thank you to all of the people who are participating. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to share my screen and show some pictures right now. So let's see here. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and the title that the organizer selected is a very good one because it is balanced between the positive and the negative. And I'm going to try to make sure that I start off with some good news. There is a little sad news, but we're going to make sure that we keep the sunny side up, so to speak. So if we think about the world of insects, let's get excited. Look at them. There are so many beautiful colors and shapes and sizes. How could we not get excited about the wonderful world of insects around us? But there's more reason to be excited about them and be interested in them. If we think about all the species of living things in the world, at least those that have been named by scientists to today, over half of them are insects. And that's why we really have to concentrate on what's happening to them, because whatever happens to the insects, because they're the majority of the living things in the world, that's pretty significant for the whole world. The reason we often, as humans, have not thought of them as much as we think about other species is probably because they're small size. The famous biologist Charles Darwin said that if people just could see things that are a little smaller than they're accustomed to, then they wouldn't pay any attention to elephants because there are so many weevils in the world. Elephants have trunks and so do weevils. And the weevils have thousands of species. The elephants have far fewer. And of course, you have to go to Africa. I went to East Africa to take this picture of the elephant. And I also had to go to West Marin to take this picture of the beautiful broad-nosed weevil, A. pleuris. And so that's wonderful. We can see the many different shapes of insects around us. But they're also found in many different places. If we look at our familiar Marin County, we are accustomed to seeing the big things, especially the plants, also the bigger animals. But famous naturalists tell us that we have to train our eyes to see things that are a little different. One of the most famous naturalists in the United States wrote this: entomology, the study of insects, extends the limits of being in a new direction, so that I walk in nature with a sense of greater space and freedom. Nature will bear the closest inspection. She invites us to lay our eyes level with the smallest leaf and take an insect view of its plane, as these little guys are doing here. She has no interstices. Every part is full of life. And so this was written by none other than Henry David Thoreau back in the early 19th century. But in addition to being everywhere and having so many wonderful shapes, colors, and sizes, they also do a lot of interesting things, these insects. So first of all, I have to say relax. If some of you are gardeners, don't worry. Although many gardeners initially get introduced to insects because some of them are eating the plants they like, most insects do not eat plants. Most of those that do eat plants also become food for other insects, birds, and other animals. And so this is the situation that exists in natural habitats. Now, of course, many of the habitats that we see most often are those that have been highly modified by humans. But let's focus on the natural ones. That's exactly what we did. Here's a beautiful natural habitat out at Point Reyes National Seashore, the sand dunes out there. A relatively simple habitat, but very beautiful. There are a lot of wonderful flowers there in the spring. A group of us from the College of Marin, faculty and students, decided we're going to try to find, at the invitation of the Park Service, as many insects as we could in this very limited habitat. And so we used a lot of different techniques, spent several years out there, and we found that, yes, as people had predicted around the world for natural habitats, fewer than half of the insects we found ate plants. The predators were a big group, and then this PPS group, parasitoids and parasites and parasitoids. Parasitoid is a strange word. It means an insect parasite that lives as a true parasite without harming its host very much when it's young, and then it kills it when it becomes an adult. And then DSF, detritivores, are those insects that eat, I would say, little dead things. Scavengers are things that eat big dead things, and fungivores are those that eat fungi. And then there are the omnivores that eat all kinds of different things. And if you'd want to get more information, I just found out that the results of this study are being published tomorrow. And so they'll be coming out in this reference here. I'm also going to be leading a field trip, I think through the auspices of the Environmental Action Committee of West Marin out there on April 21st to see some of those things. Most of the native plants that we're familiar with in their native habitats do support complex groups of insect species. So the story is a similar one to the one I just told. This is one of our most common shrubs in Marin County, the coyote brush. I think the left picture was taken on Angel Island. And yes, studies over the years have shown that hundreds of species of insects use this particular plant. And once again, the herbivores are not the biggest group. Here, I think 37.5%. Trophobionts, a word that the author of this study, the first study back in 1952, used to indicate ants, which have some kind of complicated changes in their dietary habits from time to time. Toyon, another very common shrub here, was surveyed. Over 400 species collected. We don't know exactly how many are closely associated, but it's wonderful work done there. And the oaks, a coast live oak tree that might be in bloom right now with new leaves coming shortly, could have over 20 species of caterpillar on one tree. This is what an entomologist from UC Berkeley, Jerry Powell, found in, I think it was maybe 20 years ago. And California oaks in general may support 5,000 species. Wow, look at that. The most recent book by the famous ecologist and entomologist from University of Delaware focuses on oaks as such an important support species, plant species for our native insect species. Now, on the other hand, we contrast the situation of the native plant species that support a lot of insect species with the introduced ones. So again, we did a study at the college with the College of Marin faculty and students of this famous, maybe infamous plant, French broom, grows all over Mount Tamalpais, all around Mill Valley, and it's part of the county. And if you do a survey, as we did, you're likely to find very few species eating it, very few insect species on it. We did the comparison of this particular plant species with the other native shrubs nearby, and that's what we confirmed. Now you might ask, why? Well, the reason is that we have, as humans, we've uprooted, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, these species of plants from wherever they evolved in the world and brought them here. And in doing that, we've broken their connections that they had to their own communities. We have to remember that this is something that this Earth we're on is billions of years old, and the continents have been moving around for most of that time. And if you go back, you have to go back about, maybe 300 million years ago to find a time when the continents were still largely connected. And if you think about, going back just 50 million years ago, the continents were already pretty separated. And so in those different continents, the plants and animals evolved for millions of years with each other. And now what are we doing? Ever since humans developed these powerful transportation technologies, what we've done is essentially put the continents back together by bringing these species from one continent and putting them into contact with other species that had never had any experience with them on another continent. And these different transportation technologies actually are reflected in the history of the introductions of insects, different kinds of insects to North America as well as plants. So the reason that there are not more insects on the plants that have been introduced, even if they've been introduced, well, maybe the French broom was introduced 100 years ago or more. Well, we have to compare that time over millions of years. And what's happened over the millions of years is that the different species of insects and other kinds of living things have, you might say, evolved a live and let live way of existing, coexisting. And there's therefore been a trend towards specialization. So we have lots of different insects living on one tree because each species is exploiting a different little piece of that tree. And also maybe a different season of the year. Although it's the generalists that attract more attention. Okay, so again, in our survey at Point Reyes, we found the same general situation that we find worldwide to hold. Most of the insects, we focused on the plant feeding insects here, were specialists. Now, let's look at some of these, just because it's fun to look at pictures of these marvelous insects. So here is a little tiny weevil, the long-nosed lupin weevil, and it lives on, surprise, lupins. Here is a big broad-nosed lupin weevil, also lives on lupins. Yes, if you'd like to chuckle a little bit, the first picture was of the lesser of the two weevils, and this is the greater of the two weevils. Okay, then of course we have the wonderful butterflies, and each one of these is, the species I'll show is pretty much confined to one group plant or groups of plants, one group of plants. Exactly what is a specialist has been a subject of some debate. The strictest specialist would be a species of insect that feeds on only one species of plant. There aren't too many of those. It can go from that up to maybe 3 families of plants. Given that there are 250 families of flowering plants, you get 3 out of 250. That's still somewhat specialized. And then many are only feeding on one genus. For example, this one feeds on the larvae of this butterfly feed on lupin. The little gallfly, the larva is living inside that little house that it made, only lives on coyote brush. Another plant, of course, we've already mentioned was the coyote brush, and we have another specialist herbivore that only feeds on that particular plant. The toyon has a beautiful lace bug, very tiny, but feeds only on toyon. And the madrone leaf miner, this is fun, to try to find where it is. There is the little larva chewing its way in between the upper and lower surface of the leaf on a madrone. And surprise, it only feeds on madrone. And the most famous of our specialized oak feeders is probably the California oakworm that occasionally has outbreak years, but they don't really damage the trees that much. A manzanita looper, beautiful little guy here. Okay, there are some interesting complexities to the specializations. Here is a longhorn bee, a dune longhorn bee, that is taking pollen from the gum plant, and it will take pollen from several different species of the sunflower family, but it's specialist in another way. It requires a certain texture of sand for making its burrows. On the right is a female. She's already gathered a lot of pollen that's on her hind legs, and she's just about to go into her burrow where she'll make the pollen into a little ball and lay an egg on it to provide food for her offspring. The bumblebees are often considered to be generalists, and if you look at what a particular species of bumblebee feeds on for a whole year, you get that impression. But because the colony has to survive for the entire year, and not the same species of flower is going to be in bloom all year, generally they're temporal specialists. Each week, each bumblebee colony will be feeding only on 1 or 2 species of flowers. So we call them temporal specialists. Usually, predators are more generalist than some of the other feeding groups or insects in other niches. But here's a tiger beetle, again, out there at Point Reyes. That is sort of a generalist predator, although generally these guys eat a lot of ants. But it's a habitat specialist. The young have to be raised in a particular type of burrow that has the right humidity. So it has to be a certain distance from the ocean to not be too dry or too wet. And here's a caterpillar hunting wasp. We're not sure exactly how specialist it is. I call it somewhat specialist. Most of the wasps of this genus feed on a few species of caterpillars that are specific to certain bushes. And we haven't studied enough in detail this particular species. I haven't even found out exactly what species. It could be a new species. And therefore, we can't say with certainty exactly what kind of caterpillar it eats. This is also a somewhat specialist predator. This looks like a bee superficially, but it's actually a wasp that's often called a bee wolf. It hangs out on flowers, but it's not hanging there primarily to get nectar and pollen. It's hanging there to eat the bees that come in and get the nectar and pollen. And then here's another somewhat specialist predator. This is a sand wasp, also nests in the ground, and it feeds on flies. And again, we haven't done enough studies throughout all of its range to find out exactly which species of flies it's eating in which places, but we know that out at Point Reyes, at least it was eating this dung fly, which surprisingly, not surprisingly, feeds on dung. The most famous specialist predator in California is this Vidalia beetle. This is another interesting story, that when citrus was introduced, citrus is from Southeast Asia, it was introduced into California. For a number of years, it had no insects feeding on it at all. And then suddenly, the cottony cushion scale, which is the white thing at the top of the picture here, it appeared. And of course, it had no enemies because it came from Australia and started to wipe out the incipient citrus industry. There were some entomologists who had observed that this particular beetle fed only on the cottony cushion scale, and so they were able to bring it into California, and it did control the problem. There, unfortunately, have been some other ladybird beetles or ladybugs that have been introduced that are not so specialist. And so in these biological control programs, there are rigorous protocols right now to make sure that whatever is introduced is definitely a specialist. The parasites are preferred for these programs. There are a couple of these here because parasites tend to be more specialist than predators. Here you have a couple of parasites laying their eggs into their prey. And they can get very, very special. So I love some of these pictures. Oh, I'll show a picture in a minute. Okay, this is an interesting fly that, again, we found out there at Point Reyes. A bee fly. Bee flies have long beaks and are very good at getting pollen and nectar in particular from flowers. They're fuzzy, and so they're good at transporting pollen as well. But as juveniles, unlike the bees, they are parasites. And so this one feeds on parasitic wasps. And we're not sure exactly which one, but we'll have to do some more observation, I guess. And now here we're getting to put the different pieces of the story together. We have the sand wasp. Now, as an adult, it can actually take nectar. But as we saw in one of the previous pictures, the larvae feed on the paralyzed prey that the mother has brought them. But then and then we also saw that the adults often generally prefer flies to take to their young. But this shows us an interesting, this is forensic evidence of an interesting crime. So here is the pupa of the wasp, and here's the pupa of a fly. It could be this fly that actually parasitized the young of the sand wasp. And this is a diagram I like. An old diagram shows on one caterpillar, or actually this is a beetle larva. You could have many, many different wasps, different species, each one laying its egg in a particular place. Now, of course, they wouldn't do this all on one larva, but on different ones. It just shows how specialized they are. Okay, so that's what's wonderful, right? All the great things that insects do, the places they live, the forms and colors, and it's just wonderful. And now I have to give some bad news. So there is an insect decline underway. And this is something that maybe was forecast by Rachel Carson in 1962 when she published her book Silent Spring. Although the silence in the title refers more to the absence of bird song, might refer to the absence of crickets, because as she predicted, if pesticides were not curbed, fortunately have been curbed somewhat, there would be no more birds in the future. In 2021, the UN Environmental Program published a very significant report, Making Peace with Nature, a blueprint. It's a one document that summarizes our environmental crisis worldwide as really a crisis that has three components: biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution. And so if we look at these three things, we see, okay, they're all interrelated. We can't really say we're only going to deal with one and not deal with the other. We have to deal with all of them. But biodiversity loss is the thing that we're really focusing on here because, again, insects are such a big part of it. What is biodiversity? I always put this in here whenever I give a talk because I think it illustrates well what we have as a difference between the moon in the front and the Earth in the back. We have no life on the moon as far as we know. We have a lot of life on the back. So that's the bio and biodiversity. And diversity is the absence or the opposite of uniformity. And so we have no life on the moon, so there's obviously uniformity in terms of absence of life. But on Earth, we have all these different kinds of plants and animals and insects. Of course, we've gone through already. Now, the trends over 4 billion years of life on Earth have generally been to evolve more biodiversity, again, through generally the advance of specialization to take better advantage of all the different nooks and crannies, or ecological niches, as they say, on our planet. But there have been periodic declines. The one that most people think about is the most recent one, about 65 million years ago, that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. I had to really do some time travel to go back and get a living dinosaur to photograph for you. But now there is this concern about what is called the sixth extinction. There were 5 mass extinctions before humans evolved, and now humans may be causing the extinction of as many or more species as the asteroid did. Maybe wiped out the dinosaurs. But the loss of species is not the whole story. Some people say, well, we haven't lost so many species yet. But there's this idea of the extinction vortex. It is what may be underway that is unstoppable. And then even if there are not extinctions yet of some species, if the populations have become so reduced, the number of individuals in the species is so small, then we may have lost the function of that species in the ecosystem. And the loss of the specialists and predators is especially significant because they can't be replaced. We don't have these interchangeable parts. They're specialists. And then people talk about cascade effects. That when maybe a domino effect would be a better term, but when one species is no longer playing its role in the ecosystem, then all the things it's linked to are going to suffer as well, or maybe have unpredictable effects, unpredictable responses. The vortex, just imagine you're a swimmer, and even if you're a really strong swimmer, you can maybe swim around the vortex, but if you get sucked into it too much, there's no escape. And that's the idea of the extinction vortex. Now, the windshield, early in the discussion of the insect apocalypse, as it became known popularly in the world press, the world media, people started talking, especially older people, started talking about clean windshields. There were too many clean windshields run. In the old days, whenever people went on a long drive, they would maybe have to stop several times to scrape the insects off the windshields. And that doesn't happen anymore. So of course, that's anecdotal evidence, but we do have good numbers on several important species. The monarch butterfly is one of them. And that's right, there's a show at the Bernard Garden Center going on right now, every weekend about the monarch butterfly. And this picture I took back in the year 2000, I think, down on the Monterey Peninsula. There were millions of butterflies there. And now it's difficult to find one in some of those places. So there's been a good monitoring program, thanks to Mia Monroe of the National Park Service and the Xerxes Society. And yes, even though the number of sites monitored is going up, the number of monarchs is going down. So that's one study. But then people have put together all of those studies in a meta-analysis, as they call it, of 73 different studies. These researchers back in 2019 documented, yes, that 40% of the population of insect species that have been studied are in decline. And there have been more papers coming out, more studies published since then, showing that there are the trend is truly global. Main causes are what we want to focus on: habitat loss, pollution, introduced species, and climate change. And probably basing the title on Rachel Carson's title 60 years before, Dave Wilson, an entomologist from Britain, has written a good book called Silent Earth. And again, it has a balance of bad news and good news. What really is the insect apocalypse, and what we can do about it. So I recommend that if anybody wants more reading. Okay, the effects. So some people might just say, well, okay, insects are disappearing, so what? What does it mean for us? Well, it means a lot for the rest of the world because insects are such an important part of global biodiversity. But if we think of effects, we might think of them in two parts. One is the loss of ecosystem processes, the general effects on the whole ecosystem, loss of the processes such as pollination, recycling, decomposition, all these things. And then the impacts throughout the food chain. So we lose a few small insects that are specialists on mites. We might get more mites. Then what about the things that eat the insects, the mammals, the birds, the fish, and all that? So those are the general effects. And then we think about effects on specific species. Again, the oak titmouse, once one of the most common birds in California. Fortunately, we still have them in the oak trees around my house here. But they have been declining every year, 2% per year. You may say that's not that much, but it happens every year. Then there's a cumulative decline that is very large. And of course, what do most of these nesting birds feed their young? Insects. And so if the insects disappear out of the oak trees disappear, and there are no more insects, then there are no more oak titmouse after a while. And yes, there was another big paper, a meta-analysis, focusing on North American bird declines, using a lot of different technologies. 3 billion birds lost in North America since 1970. 29% of that abundance, so almost a third. And again, habitat loss was probably the biggest, and then direct killing, climate change. What about humans? That's the other thing a lot of people want to know. What are going to be the effects on humans? More pests, more disease, less food. Doesn't sound very good, does it? Why are there more pests? Because as the specialists get eliminated, then the stage is freed for these generalists. And of course, we're generalists as humans, so we're doing fairly well in the world so far. But there are these other things. This particular caterpillar has different names indicate can attack corn, tomato, cotton. It's doing well, especially if its parasites and predators get wiped out. Then of course, we have our cockroach, which is not really American, but it's doing well. The Norway rat, which is not really from Norway, it's doing well too. And guess what? We have generalist pathogens. There was, I think, a pandemic most people heard about just recently, and it's not going to be the last pandemic, and it's not really wasn't the first. So these pandemics are becoming more and more common as well because these pathogens, and we know that most of our human infectious diseases have spilled over from other animals, and we know that COVID-19 actually, or SARS-CoV-2, has been noted now in 30 different species. Okay, food. Will we run out of food? Well, pest outbreaks will become greater, and so that's a concern, but also pollination will disappear if the insects disappear. Some people have said, don't worry, we'll have bread because wheat is wind pollinated, not insect pollinated, but anyway, get the point. Okay, what about the causes? So again, we go back to all the studies, and we see that these are the big four, you know, habitat loss and fragmentation, maybe that's two, maybe it's a big five. Pollution, invasive species, and climate change. Climate change, of course, is affecting everything. In California, at least, and probably throughout most of the world, it's habitat loss is a bigger threat, but it joins with climate change, because as there is less and less habitat, then then organisms have to move around. But if they can't move around to areas of the same climate because the climate's changed, then they've got a problem. Pollution, particularly, we'll talk about, you know, insecticides and light, and invasive species. So as the generalist invasive species move around and they push out the other species that were there before. So, okay, see, that was very short for the bad news, right? It's important. We have to remember that those are the hard facts, but we can do something about it. So let's find the good news here. So we just look at the causes and we take them away, right? Sounds easy, but there are practical things we can do. So in terms of habitat loss and fragmentation, we can make more habitat. We can plant these diversity gardens, we'll talk about in a few minutes. We protect them from invasive species and pollution. Then we connect them to reverse the fragmentation. And of course, it is important to work on climate change and to slow that climate change to give everything else a better chance of working. So what is this thing I call a diversity garden? There are many different garden names that have popped up over the last few years: the bee gardens, the pollinator gardens. Then of course, many are drought-wise gardens and fire-safe gardens. But the diversity garden would ideally emphasize, maximize, facilitate increase in all of diversity of living things. So a couple basic principles. Again, we have to look at the global view, take the global view. A diversity garden be close enough to other good habitat for insects dispersal into it. If there's that old saying, if you build it, they will come. That's true to some extent, if there's a source nearby. And then the diversity garden has to be similar enough to the natural communities nearby to be attractive. It would contain at least 70%, possibly hyperlocal, but at least locally native plants. We'll talk a little more about this. This is the figure Doug Tallamy's come up with and in his studies. It contains a large diversity of plants that produce leaves, nectar, and or pollen throughout the year, which are things that the insects need. And it has nesting sites, such as bare ground and leaf litter. A lot of our local insects are ground nesting. It uses minimal pesticides, so there are a couple, and is shielded from light at night. So a couple kinds of pollution. We think about chemical pollution, yes, particularly neonicotinoid pesticides have been a tremendously important factor in the last few years that probably cause a lot of insect loss. And then light pollution is important as well, because over 50% of animals in general, not just insects, are active at night. If we continue to pollute the night and cause what many people have called the loss of the night, then what's going to happen to those species? A diversity garden also evolves slowly over time. That's the way nature does it. We can't expect instant gardens, even though that may be some satisfying on some levels. And a diversity garden can also be a fire-safe garden. So we think about, boy, the need for these ground nesting insects to have bare ground. Well, bare ground is something that is great for a fire-safe garden. It's close to the house, right? Okay, we can be happy that right here in Marin, Judith Larner Lowry started to write and talk, get people thinking about the mindset that we need if we're really going to make diversity gardens. And she's done tremendous work in this area. More recently, as we mentioned, Doug Tallamy has been quantifying the result. He's done it with his army of students. He's done some amazing work. They've all done some amazing work. Calculated how many grams of a native plant are necessary to produce how many grams of caterpillars of a particular species of native insect, and that how many grams of that are necessary to produce a fledgling of a particular native bird. Incredible study. Well, this is where he's really been very important in bringing this to our attention. The California Wildlife Habitat Garden, not only the not only the insects, but also the hummingbirds and other birds. In terms of native plant gardening, there are a lot of resources. Greg Rubin and Lucy Warren have been focusing on native plants and the techniques needed to grow them well. They have information on irrigation. Greg's also done some work on fire safety. And then this is the latest, not actually the latest book that Doug Talmey wrote was the Oak book. But this is probably his biggest one and the one that became the bestseller. And his idea is that if we think about the potential that we have in our own backyards to restore habitat, to reduce fragmentation, we could have a bigger effect than all the national parks. And so he baptized this the homegrown national park idea. And that's something really to think about. Then with the fires we've had, there's tremendous opportunity for thinking about what will go back where the fires were, or where what was fire, I guess, unsafe, where that was. Now, there is something that is emerging in the world of landscaping, as it is emerging in the world of news, other areas of human endeavor as well, hyperlocal. So we know that the big newspapers are having trouble, but the hyperlocal neighborhood newspapers doing much better. In terms of landscaping, there of course has been the international landscape trade, bringing plants from other parts of the world. That's also brought us a problem such as sudden oak death, and then the lack of food for our native insects and birds and other members of the ecological community. But even if we're thinking about native plants, it's okay to buy them. Say a native plant, if it's produced in Los Angeles, maybe it's, okay, it's a California native plant. Maybe actually it's the same species, one that's grown here. That's probably better than planting one that's not native. But if we plant things that are not really local, then we have a decrease in genetic diversity. And if we just have, say, there's one giant nursery in Los Angeles, I'm just making this up hypothetically, there are several large native plant nurseries, but if they begin to corner the market, then we're going to have a loss of genetic diversity. And also, we have to remember that even one native species of plant is going to have a lot of local adaptation, even here in Marin County, from one side of the hill to the other, one side of the county to the other. And so if we plant the locally adapt, the hyperlocal plants, we're going to have local adaptation to soil and drought conditions. And then there have been some studies about how maybe the plant, we'll talk about this a little more, how plants that have been, even native plants that have been named as varieties and introduced into the nursery trade may not be so good for our local wildlife. The local plants tend to be healthier. And then of course, if we're just buying things from that are produced far away, we're not getting the local cultural knowledge. And if we're buying big plants, again, for the instant look, then we're not getting the appreciation for natural growth and development. That's one of the things Doug Talmey points out, that he planted an acorn at the same time his daughter was born. And then he also, I don't know if he also planted a container grown plant or watched one nearby. By the time his daughter was 10 years old, his tree planted from an acorn was bigger than the big tree that was bought and planted. Anyway, so who's encouraging this? Well, we're fortunate here in the Bay Area to have some real hotspots of hyperlocal landscaping. Here are here's, I guess this is a native nursery, in the East Bay. And it is, it basically has hyperlocal locations. Wherever you live in the East Bay, you can find a location very close to you. There's Redwood Regional Park, Chabot Regional Park, Orinda, Lafayette. They have agreements with the East Bay Regional Parks and the Monte Diablo State Park and other landowners and managers to collect seeds and cuttings and other propagules and propagate them so that they'll be adapted to those very local conditions. Here in Marin, Charlotte Torgovitsky at Homegrown Habitats in Nevada is doing that. And we do have an incipient Marin County nursery that until last year only had a half-time nursery manager, but I think now it's going to become full-time. So great opportunities here. This is my own nursery on my own patio. I just wait until berries and other things fall down, or somebody, the gardeners are nearby, prune off some plants that are native, and I put them into pots and grow them. Sometimes I don't even have to do that. Here's what the birds have done. There's a Petuniaster there that was planted, and then the birds planted a coast live oak underneath it. On the right, a privet that was planted, and the birds planted a toyon. So our landscapes want to be hyperlocal and native. If we let them, they'll do it in many cases. This is yarrow, a wonderful plant for nectar, but this is the native form that's a shot up above from out there at Point Reyes. There's been a red or pink form introduced into the nursery trade, and some of the studies have shown that it's not as attractive to our local insects, and they don't use it as much. The analogy for humans would be, what is it, Hard Tomatoes, Hard Times, the book that was written about the tomato being bred for mechanical harvesting rather than flavor. Okay, and then of course the beautiful scrub jay here with the acorn. Yes, plant an acorn rather than buying a tree that's produced, a large oak tree that was produced somewhere else. You want to plant an oak tree, and it'll do much better if you get it from locally, a local source. What are some examples of some valuable plant groups? Well, again, these are just some highlights. Plants supporting many species would include the oaks, toyon, and coyote brush that we discussed already. The especially good nectar plants are sages, yarrow, cinos, and buckwheat. Early flowering plants include the manzanitas. Late flowering plants, the zauschneria or California fuchsia, the gum plant, coyote brush. But even if you plant the plants, which is good, that have been shown to host the largest number of insects, you want to remember the idea of specialization. Even if you plant all the plants up there, that we've just discussed, you won't have the monarch butterfly, because we didn't discuss milkweed yet. You won't have the pipevine swallowtail butterfly, because we haven't talked about pipevines. So any locally native plant would be very good, but a diversity of them very good. Okay, there are some internet resources here that can help people, and I'll definitely make these available to the organizers to pass on. And of course, our local Marin Flora has a list of all the species that are native to Marin County. Okay, but how do we connect the diversity gardens to each other and to the people? So here's the ecological symbolism of conservation biology that indicates that if we have a core, it's important to have big core areas for conservation. And then if there are little core areas or little, not core areas, little satellite areas, I guess, around them, they need to be connected with corridors to make the entire complex realize its potential in conservation biology. So here we have Marin County, and we look at the center of the picture, we see Mount Tam. Okay, that's a big core area protected by the Water District and by the state parks. We've got core areas in West Marin, the Point Reyes National Seashore, GGNRA, but then all of these other areas, we could look at them as potential habitat as well. And so, particularly in East Marin, we can see that the officially protected areas are very fragmented and also isolated from the West Marin. So if we could just draw some lines, there we go. If we could connect them in intelligent ways, all of Marin County would be contributing much more to insect biodiversity and to biodiversity in general. So how do we make that happen? Well, part of it is each person doing something individually, but also, as we've seen with the environmental successes in Marin County over the years, public policy and public officials have a big role to play as well. Internationally, the recognition of urban and suburban areas as great areas having great potential for biodiversity enhancement has led to several great papers and presentations at international conferences. We have good global models now, and we just need we just need better local policy. That's one area where Marin's sort of falling behind. But where is the place that's leading the world? Surprise, surprise. Singapore, one of the most heavily urbanized areas in the world. A friend of mine who was from there says sort of was like a concrete jungle. He arrived in the 1980s, but they saw the problem, and they were the first major city to say that they needed a strategy to deal with it. They produced what's become known as the Singapore Biodiversity Index. It's been updated every couple of years. I think the latest update was 2021. If you Google Singapore Biodiversity Index, you'll find it. You can read the whole thing, or I can just tell you, these are all some of the cities that have signed on. That's a long time ago. These are the recommendations. First, do inventory. Find out, what are the plants growing around you, and if possible, what are the insects there? But at least if, at the very least, if you are able to count the number of native species of plants and the number of non-native species, that's a great start. And then simply gradually improve. And then you're going forward instead of backwards. So first take stock of your neighborhood. And I have to thank Bonnie Morse, who pioneered studies here in Marin County. She lives in San Rafael, went to several neighborhoods and did exactly that. Just from the street, she was able to count the natives and non-native species on the street and in people's front yards. And she found that fewer than 1% of the plants were native. And so basically, this is the equivalent of a food desert, for human, but for wildlife. And we find that in many places, it's less than 1%. So we can improve it. So great opportunities right now. Recently, the Marin County-wide plan was updated well, actually not the whole county-wide plan, it was a housing element. And so there's this big concern in Marin that all this new housing is going to be built and the state is forcing it on everybody. Well, there is something we can do to influence what kind of habitat that housing represents. And so the form-based code in the Marin County housing element, after a significant amount of input from different people around the county, now has the 70% native plant species requirement in it. And so that is something that the state will accept. The plans of individual cities and towns are still being written. I think Novato has agreed to accept the 70% that's in the county code. All plan change to landscapes, whether they are subject to these codes, to these plans or not, could be analyzed with the same eye. And there are new sustainability coordinators popping up in many, many different cities and towns, including Mill Valley. And so these people can be invited to improve biodiversity wherever they are. And this will benefit both new and existing biodiversity projects. Many people, okay, this is the report that appeared in the Marin IJ, the approval of the housing element of Marin County. What wasn't lost there wasn't reported was the improvement to the form-based code. Okay. People on their own have taken the important step of putting native plants and making these diversity gardens wherever they can. This is an island out in front of the Tropic Island near the Lark Theater in Larkspur, Center Median and University Avenue in Berkeley. There's Marcia Basala, who 10 years ago on her own adopted a traffic island and started planting native plants on it. So that's something we can do. And then, of course, we can bring it all back together, look at the whole planet, take the holistic view, connect the people to the land and the local to the global. So I know this is the Outdoor Art Club. So I thought I should conclude by showing some outdoor art. This is, of course, marine life. Here we have some insects. This is a UC Davis bee garden. And sculptures, but we want to make sure that we include the people and think of the connections that we can make between people and the other inhabitants of our planet. So this is an important event, the inauguration of this mural in the Canal District in San Rafael. And because I know some of the people, the artists who painted this, it's actually showing many of the same things we show in depictions of insects, birds, fish, different source areas, different methods of transportation or migration. And so if we bring all this together, we'll connect the people to the land. And then of course we want to collect the local to the global. Here is, I think that's my wife pointing at, maybe, is that Mill Valley? Could be Mill Valley. Okay. And then of course, the global. So if we're doing our best here in Mill Valley, in Marin County, in California, then we'll be improving the entire planet. So I think that's pretty much where I'll end. The Marin Biodiversity Corridor Initiative is this group. It's a collaborative of different environmental organizations in Marin devoted to this goal of improving habitat in Marin, particularly Central and East Marin. And it has its website there, marinbiodiversity.org. And now I will come back and see everybody in person. I think that in the Zoom format, it is a little different because instead of seeing everybody's faces, I see the screen. But I'm glad to be back with everybody now.
Wow. Paul, thank you. I missed the beginning. We had some technical difficulty, but that was the most positive exposure I've had to the insect crisis since 12 months ago when I started kind of studying it. I have a couple of your book recommendations, and I wanted to, I'll ask you to maybe give us those along with your resources. But I'm going to try to be quick because I know we're going to run probably 5 minutes late. I think you didn't get a proper introduction. And if that's the case, I would like to let people know a little bit about you, and then we'll do 4 or 5 questions. How about that? Does that sound good? Okay.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Yes.
Okay. So I had the pleasure of meeting Paul and his wife a couple of weeks ago. We've been communicating by email for a long time, and it's really been an inspiration. Paul has more than 4 decades of teaching experience, including 23 years at the College of Marin, where he taught biology, natural history, environmental science, and environmental landscaping. While he was on the faculty there, he also served as department chair, academic senator, on numerous internal college committees, and as an advisor to some student organizations. He helped revitalize the organic farm and garden, the science museum, and the field station. But what I appreciate the most, and I think you all discovered this today, is that Dr. De Silva is an enthusiastic scientist and educator. So thank you, and thank you for having that sort of positive connection and or positive explanation of how important it is for us to connect locally, globally, to each other, to the land, etc. So I'm going to quickly take a few questions that we have in the Q&A here. One question we had was, what do you think of bug hotels?
What do I think of bug hotels? Well, you know, there are some garden stores that sell, for example, the different, I guess they're dowels that are, or wood drilled with different diameter holes for bees. I think they're okay. They can supplement nesting sites for bees, because many bees that don't nest in the ground nest in hollowed out twigs where the pith is, either they take out the pith or the pith is beginning to decay. And so this is a substitute for that. But I think it's better to leave some plants that have died, maybe annual plants or maybe even perennial plants, with their twigs, so that the natural sites can be available. One of the problems with a hotel is that it's a concentrated place, and that can be a place where disease could spread. So they're okay, but I think that making the natural habitat in the garden is probably better.
Okay. So on that subject, we have another question. How can we protect insects and get rid of fungi and other problems for our garden plants that are not all native?
Well, the most important thing is to make sure the plants are healthy. And so a healthy, vigorously growing plant is going to resist all kinds of things that might do it in if we're not growing so well. And so it's important to have plants that are well adapted to the local habitat, whether they're native or non-native. They are going to do better if they have, for example, you wouldn't want to plant something that needs a lot of water in our climate, except next to a stream. because it will get stressed during the summer. And when it's stressed, then it will be more susceptible to insects and diseases. So the most important thing is to have your plants growing well, make sure they're well adapted. I know one thing people forget a lot, if they're growing potted plants, you have to repot your plants all the time to give them soil where their roots can breathe. And, all those, use good cultural practices. So yes, I think that that's the number one thing. And then, as I say, if they're in good shape and they're growing well, if a few insects attack them, or they do get a little bit of fungal damage, that's not going to be fatal.
Oh. Well, we have not a similar question, but something along those lines. Somebody wanted to ask you to address the soil food web ecology and how beneficial fungi are.
Well, right. So as in the world of insects, there are fungi that do an incredible diversity of things in ecosystems. So some of the fungi are decomposers, and they help to liberate nutrients for plants by decomposing things that die. Others are the mycorrhizae that will get onto the roots of plants and help transport mineral nutrients to them so that they'll be healthier plants. So there are many different things that fungi do in the soil, the same way there are many different things that insects do. And in fact, the insects and fungi are related when it comes to decomposition, because insects tend to break down the large pieces of dead things, and then the fungi take over and break them down into smaller pieces, and finally releasing their nutrients to the plant roots. So yes, that's another topic. I mean, you want to invite a mycologist to talk about the soil food web. That's tremendously important subject. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we can take two more questions. Somebody asked, and maybe we can do this afterwards, if you could provide contact info for purchasing native plants in Marin, or if it's simple, if you have a recommendation for that, I guess.
Well, this timing is wonderful, because it so happens that the California Native Plant Society's Marin chapter has just announced their spring plant sale, which is going to be available. They're going to have plants available online. I think it's going to be April 5th. So that's a wonderful source of local plants. And so what you do is you go online, you order them, and then they have them for pickup at the Bon Air Shopping Center in Green Bay, I think 2 weeks later. I think it's going to, let me see my calendar here. I think that's going to be, I think it's the 15th, maybe a week later.
That sounds good. That was a timely question. And we have a question about the impact of lights on insects. And I know that's, so just if you could talk a little bit more about that. I know you addressed it briefly.
Right. And so every insect, like every other animal, has particular behaviors, particular things that it needs to do in particular conditions. One of the reasons most of the caterpillars are active at night is because that's when the birds are not active, right? Birds can't see them. Birds are visual predators. And so that's why so many of the caterpillars have become not only active at night, but very camouflaged. So, what can we do to diminish the loss of the night? We can put all the night lights on timers so that it's only when we actually need the light that it's there. And then also direct the light through use of appropriate shielding devices to exactly where we want it to be. So we don't have unshielded lights lighting up the whole night.
Well, that answered the question that I had, because I was wondering if it was good to have those timers on, because they would just turn on in the middle of the night when you don't need them, when somebody goes by. But it sounds like that's better.
Well, I guess it's a question of gradation. So the best thing for the insects would be have no lights at all. But then we know that there are safety concerns. So then, having lights placed in only a few places, having them well shielded, having them on timers, yeah.
And then I'll take this last question. Somebody wanted to know the importance of mayflies, wanted to know a little bit more about mayflies.
Well, as I mentioned, insects are important in food chains. And so we think of food chains on land because we're on land, but it's also true in the water. So people who fish know well the importance of mayflies as food for fish. So if we're thinking about rivers and streams, and we're thinking about the fish that live in rivers and streams, where does most of their food come from? Most of their food was not produced inside the stream. most of the food is produced outside the stream, and it's the insects that fall into the stream from stream-side plants that provide most of the food for insects, and mayflies are in that group. Now, mayflies come out of the it's interesting because as a case in dragonflies and other insects as well, they have two phases to their life cycle. One's out in the air and one's in the water. So mayflies will actually lay their eggs in the water. The larvae develop, and the young ones develop in the water, and then they emerge to the adult form and have to go into the air. And it's at that particular time when they're emerging from the aquatic phase to the aerial phase that the fish love to gobble them up. And so all of the fishing literature and the fishing lore is all replete with these stories of wonderful mayfly emergences. Yeah.
Oh. Yeah. There's actually one more question that I overlooked, and then we'll close. Someone requested that you address the hydrosphere and how we need systemic health of soil and vegetative connectivity.
Well, the hydrosphere is the water, right? And so when we're thinking about our gardens as well, and particularly in our urban and suburban areas, we have to remember that the water has to go someplace. And if we cover up the surface of the soil with concrete and asphalt, artificial turf, and all this, we're depriving the soil of its water. And so we have to think of that. We also have to think of how we are producing canopy, so vegetation. So where there has been a lot of forest cutting, tree cutting, frequently flood follows. And so that's because the soil is no longer protected by the vegetation. So we have to think about interception of the rains. We want to have some canopy cover all year round so that when the rains come, particularly as they are this time of year, that they'll have something to break their fall, the raindrop fall as they go into the ground. And then we have to make sure there's a pervious surface to absorb that water. And then, of course, that water will be released gradually into the streams and the brooks and the creeks, and we won't have such floods.
Well, thank you. Thank you again, Paul, and to the Zoom team for today's very, very informative session. I want to just remind everybody that we have another upcoming webinar on April 20th, California Wildflowers and Climate Change. And we'll have acclaimed conservation photographer Nita Winter and Bob Badger, and we hope to see you all there. So again, thank you everybody for attending. Paul, thanks, and hope to see you guys next time.